Hey guys, Darren Kelly, Coach of Watch Pods, and welcome back to the third episode of this short series where we are discussing player positions. On today's episode, we are talking about the vital midfield role, which more than ever feels like is going to be the line that wins the Hilux this year. In my opinion, there's so much value and a plethora of options that we need to discuss and different strategies that we will discuss in today's video. So consider this as your one-stop shop for all your midfield line needs, as I'll be discussing all the fantasy relevant options so that you should be considering for your fantasy side. To start with, let's get into it.
All the pain.
So before I get into the individual players, I just want to quickly recap on the way that I structured up these certain players in different categories, if you haven't seen my videos before. So I've divided them into 4 different categories. That is premiums, underpriced premiums, midfielders, mid-pricers, sorry, and then rookies. So 4 different categories there, and just a quick summary of what each of those are. So premiums, if you're selecting a premium in your side to start off the season, you pretty much want to be confident that they're going to finish in the top 8 for you for the entire season as an overall average, which isn't as easy as it might seem. You know, we've got some pretty big names in there that are pretty consistent in that top 8, but it isn't as simple as just that, as the midfield is quite a volatile role when it comes to averages. At the moment there are 17 players, midfielders specifically, that are averaging anywhere from between 100 and 110. So at any given time, if a player has a good run or just has like a big bump in their scoring ability for a period of time, that significantly jumps up their average, and then they're a top 8 midfielder, and that bumps someone else out. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, a merit, he's going to be a top 8 midfielder every single year, because that's what he's sort of done for probably the best part of a decade. But it's not always as consistent as that. You've got your superstars like that, but for a lot of the other players, it can be quite volatile. For the underpriced premiums, that you're really looking for that upside to become a potential keeper for the entire year. That they're probably priced around that 90 to 100 range, where they're probably just outside of the top sort of 10 or so in that line. Specifically, if you're talking about midfield, you're probably looking in the 25 sort of area. So you're really looking for them to increase their average enough that they're going to be close enough to the top 8, and that potentially become a hold for a long period of the time for the season, or even potentially become a hold for the entire season. That way you minimize having to use many trades for that particular person. That gives you off to a great start. This can really come from someone that has previously been a premium for us. An Oliver is a pretty good example this year, where he has been an absolute premium for us. He's averaged 115. He is now way priced down at 77 or something like that. So he has shown he could be a premium, but he's just down in price. Or it is someone that has the potential to be a premium that hasn't shown it consistently enough to be a premium for the entire season. They've probably shown it in patches throughout AFL games or even VFL games. They've shown potential to be a good fantasy scorer. You just gotta, it's not as cutthroat as someone that has just been there before. So you gotta really keep an eye on that one. Mid-price is really just looking for that value and that cash generation and points on field per dollar. So really maximizing your money there by putting points on field, rather than just going down to rookies and relying on these unreliable rookies that are potentially not going to be in the best 22 every single week. You've got these guys that are underpriced. You're looking at the forward line, you've got the McRaes and Bailey Smiths and Caleb Daniels. They're easily best 22 in terms of their teams, and they're by far underpriced and probably classified in that mid-price range. And finally, you got your rookies, which is in terms of the midfield role, is by far the best cash generation for us. Every single year we get a plethora of midfield options that come through from the draft that always seem to get a pretty good opportunity at the AFL system pretty quickly in their debut year. So there's plenty to choose from, and it's always a bit tricky with trying to decipher who's going to be playing and what role they're going to have, because they always aren't played in position, most likely. So that's the 4 different categories. Now we'll get into the individual players, and we'll start with the premium, so your top dogs and your keepers. And I will say right off the top that I have pretty much just removed anyone that has the early buys. So I won't be talking about your day costs, your El Gordons and stuff like that. I just don't see a world where I'd be paying up for them. Uh, Particularly this year, like I think last year you probably could have got away with it a little bit more because the buys were spread out a little bit more. This year they're obviously condensed to just the 4 rounds, so it's probably not as uh, what's the word I'm looking for here? Feasible to do it. So sorry, sketching. So yeah, I just removed them from my calculations in terms of that pick, but I understand that the likes of Dacos is pretty popular when it comes to his selection. I think he's if I can find him here, he's 24% owned at the moment, and there's belief that he can be a 115 guy, and I don't disagree with that. Like at the end of the day, Collingwood were the third worst fantasy team in the competition last year, so if they even bump that up to the mid-table, that definitely means there's plenty of points for Dacos to get a lot more there, because he has been a 112 guy I think before, but he was a defender back then, so it was a much different role that he's playing now. So there's definitely the potential for him, but probably not someone that I'm looking to start so far this season. I think it's a tough run to start as well. So I've removed him from my calculations, and yeah, there's that. So we'll just head down the list, and the first one that sort of came into my calculations, I don't really know why it's not showing who has the buy and who doesn't have the buy right now. Maybe if I quickly give it a refresh, it might help it. There you go, midfielders. No, didn't help. Anyways, so the first one that comes into my calculations is Marcus Bontempelli, and I think a lot of people know the reason why. I was unfortunately enough to start him last year when he was priced at 117, so he is well under that. He's under 10 points based on that average from last season, so definitely has a lot of upside, and again, by far be the best fantasy player when he's playing in the right role. It's just if he's going to be playing that role, and the concern, I guess, is he does want to spend a lot more time forward. We saw it a lot last year where he did spend a lot more time forward and was kicking goals, so he is used as that weapon up there a fair bit, and that really limits his ceiling a lot of the time. So am I expecting him to probably spend more time forward again? Probably, with the news of Jamal Hagen being injured, and Aaron Norton regularly injured as well. They are struggling for tall forward options, so he does have the body that can compete up there. He's got the muscle, he's got the height, so he has the potential to go forward in quite regularly in games like we saw last year. So he's probably one I'm not super confident in starting right now. I would probably need to see a bit more in the preseason to be an absolute lock on my side. I know he's 18% owned at the moment, so he is quite popular. I want to see the tackle numbers jump up again. He dropped by 2 tackles per game last season, so he really lost that tackle and that hunger for the footy last season. I thought it might have been Treloar, but it wasn't. Treloar pretty much stayed the same, even though he had a phenomenal year. And probably just touch on Treloar since I skipped over him completely. He's just too expensive, and he does have that injury to start the season. I think it's a core. No, I think it's a calf issue he has currently, so he potentially misses the start of the season. I think he might even miss the first four weeks. I don't think it's confirmed just yet, but definitely looking like he'll miss part of the start of the season. So that could mean Bontempelli may spend more time in the forward, but they have a plethora of options that could spend time in the midfield. Libba will be the other mainstay in there. They've thrown Ed Richards through there quite a fair bit. Last season, he looks like he's a golden boy and Bevo wants him in there. They recruited the likes of Matt Kennedy, so he could go in there quite regularly. He did that at Carlton for a while, so yeah, I can see a world where they go in. And then you've also got the draftee and Riley Sanders in his second year, so there's plenty of options that may go in there before the likes of Bontempelli. When a shoulder drill goes down, it's not always going to just be, okay, Bont, go back to what you're doing. So I'd need to see something in the preseason to say absolutely lock him in. He's going to be a mainstay midfielder this year. I just don't see it at this point in time. I think he's going to spend a lot more time forward, particularly because I don't see the Doggies being super powerhouse this year. I think they'll probably be around that sort of, 6 to 10 sort of range, just battling for the top 8. I don't think they're going to be competing for top 4 at all. So, yeah, I just don't see a world where he will be a mainstay midfielder. So I'll pass on him for now. I also want to see him get a haircut. He's rocking the rolling with the man bun at the moment. So, and we have seen in the past that it's not always the best haircut for him. That does Marcus Bontempelli. The next person I want to talk about is Sam Walsh. I will skip over Jack Steele just because I don't believe Jack Steele is much of anything. You know, with the likes of Jack McRae coming to the side, I think Jack McRae will absolutely rack up a lot of points in that St Kilda jumper. So I think that's going to take points away from the likes of Steele and not rely on him as much. So yeah, I just see him a word where he drops and becomes a bit more of an accountable midfielder and be probably a 95 to 100 guy. So he's way over that at the moment. Back on to Sam Walsh. Now, he's probably one that you probably pay for what you get, right? He's a 106 guy. He's been a 109 guy previously at his best. So there's potential that he could have a bit of upside, but I'm not seeing a world where he does go that next best. You know, last season he went back to that full-time midfield role, being alongside Cripper, being that number 2. And he had a good run at the start of season, particularly where he was sort of averaging like 115 or so, but then dropped off late in the season, whether he was having an injury or not. He's also had an injury to start this season. I can't remember exactly what it was, maybe a hamstring or something like that. So he's battling injuries, and it's just a bit of a no for me. Even though he is probably back in training currently and getting back to full fitness, it's just enough to be like, okay, if he wanted to be this sort of 115, 110 sort of guy for the entire season, I really want him to have a full preseason and just stay fit, where he doesn't seem to be able to do that for a long period of time. He seems to always have a bit of a niggle here and there at the start of the season, particularly. So I think the last 2 seasons he's missed the first round. So yeah, one, I think if you're looking to start, you're really starting him particularly for their run to start the season. So I'll show you that here as a full-time midfielder. There you go, Richmond, the first game, which is obviously a glorious matchup. But then they go into Hawthorn and the Dogs, which are a bit tougher. But then it sort of opens up for a 5-game stretch with Collingwood, West Coast, North, Geelong, and Adelaide. So it is a pretty decent run to start the season and could get you off to a bit of a flyer in terms of captaincy. I could see a world where he absolutely lights it up, but probably one I'm not willing to pay out for when I don't see much upside in him just yet. The next one is Jordan Dawson, is another one that I was pretty keen on when I first started my research. I love their run to start the season. I'll show you that again, if I can find it. So there you go, St Kilda, which is a hard one to start the season, but Essendon, North, the Gold Coast, and Geelong start in the first 5 weeks is just absolutely immaculate. He's just going to rip it apart. So the other thing that I want him to have is, you know, he could be the best fantasy player. I know I've said that about Marcus Bontempelli, but Dawson has the same ability as the likes of Bont. He's got the height, so he's a good marker overhead. He's got the strong tackling ability, and he's just got an elite kick. So the team really looks for him in that sense, where they just want him to be kicking it into the forward 50. But he also has that same package where if they're lacking in the forward line with tall forwards, they throw him forward. We saw that a bit last season where he had a pretty big drop in CBAs, where previous year he was an 85% full-time midfielder. He dropped that down to about 50% towards the back end of last season, just because they were struggling with tall forward options up forward. So they threw him forward. They had plenty of other guys that would run through the midfield with, you know, Crouch, Laird, Soligo, Berry, you know, a fair few others. Keys could even go through there. Then they had Rankin that's going through there. And it's only going to get worse this season as well, particularly with their recruits. You know, Cumming, Peatling, Neil Bullen, all have the capability of going in the midfield, plus still Sid Draper. There's just a plethora of guys that can run through that midfield. So it's really starting to weigh on me that I think he spends more time forward, like a Bontempelli, and that potentially he's not worth paying up for at his price at 105. Even though he has such a good run and he's, you know, at a 105, even though he's been a 113 sort of guy previously and can be that again. So probably another one I'm not willing to pay for. And it seems like a pretty consistent theme at this point in time of the year, where there's a lot of these top dollar guys that don't really look like they have too much upside and all have a lot of negatives that, you know, things could definitely go wrong. The other thing I wanted to sort of mention is that, which I'm not super knowledgeable in this sort of area, but the way AFL fantasy works is that the player to the game cap, the player, sorry, the money in the bank, or whatever you want to call it, the system is always even. So if the rookies manage to increase the average so much, it means that the top dogs are only one bad score away from being absolutely dropping in cash quite quickly. So that can really hurt you if things don't go your way. You know, if he drops a 90 or an 80 to start the season, he could drop 100k pretty quickly to start the season, just because all the other rookies are massively jumping up in price if they have a good game. And we're expecting to have quite a few of those, particularly in the midfield this year, so which we will discuss. So for that reason, I'm not looking at starting Jordan Dawson for that reason as well. I do feel like I'll maybe pick I sort of come across in these videos, but Andy Brayshaw is another one I really like this so far this year. Priced at 105, so $1.73 million, so he's up there. But it is not uncommon to say that he is underpriced. He has averaged 110 and 112 in the past 2 seasons, so he is well under that. And we know how good he can be. He's been the number one sort of player for us previously, and I have had the luxury of owning him during that period. What made him the cheap option he is today is the fact that he spent a bit of time on the wing last season, particularly with the likes of, Fife coming back into that midfield after having a pretty good season in his ability, just being able to get on the park a little bit more. So that's meant someone had to leave the midfield, and, Sarong seems to be the mainstay in there at the moment. He's an 85% CBA taker. Then you've got the likes of Hayden Young that spent a fair bit of time in there last season, as he had in the first season that he trained as a full-time midfielder. Towards the back end of the season, we sort of saw him, Hayden Young, move out of that role a little bit and move a bit more forward. So that's sort of what I'm expecting this season, where Hayden Young spends a bit more time forward, sort of 50% midfield, 50% forward. And that sort of frees up more inside mid role for Brayshaw, where we saw him be much better back in the back end of the season. So that's what I really like about Brayshaw. He's got that previous ability to be the top dog, and he's got that fantasy accumulation. He's also got a really strong fixture to start the season. I'll show you that here. So Geelong, Sydney, West Coast, Western Bulldogs, Richmond, and Melbourne, and then you can even throw in Adelaide there. That's a pretty strong stretch to start the first part of the season. That's probably 4 or 5 captain options you can throw straight on him, straight with no worries, and not even have to consider too much into it. So that's another big consideration when you're paying up for this sort of top dogs. You really want them to have a strong start to the season, because at the end of the day, if they have a pretty poor score, like I said, they're going to drop pretty quickly just with all the other rookies going well. So, that's the thing you got to consider. However, with that early fixture, I did look into the scores that he had against those teams last year, and it wasn't the greatest scores against them particularly. He scored pretty much 80s to 100s, so that did sort of put a bit of bummer on that sort of pick for me. But I do expect him to be a bit better this season, like I said, with a better role and not playing as much wing time. So expect him to be sort of a top 4 mid for us all year. So he's probably one I'd happily start so far this season. If you're looking for a premium option in the midfield line, he's, like I said, he's going to be a capped option. He has a huge ceiling. Like, I remember the days of 2 or 3 years ago where he scored that 181 in round 2. It was just absolutely ballistic, and I remember a few people had him capped, and it was just unreal. So he definitely has a big ceiling and can get you off to a flyer. So definitely one to consider. The cons about him is the Freo game style is becoming a lot quicker, very similar to the Tigers in my opinion, and they've got a lot of young talent that has a lot of speed and they're really moving to this handball happy sort of game style, which isn't super intrusive to fantasy scoring. We only saw it with the Tigers back in 17, 19, 20, that they didn't have huge fantasy scores, just because the ball was moving so quickly from defensive 50 to forward 50 and scoring from there, that it didn't allow these midfielders to absolutely rack it up. So there's a lot of concern in me that there's potential that he even drops in average because of that style. does it lead him to not able to get the ball in his hands as much as he probably want? Does it rely more on the halfback players, which we've seen as a pretty common theme across the competition, that the halfbacks are getting a lot more points rather than these midfielders? So there, I need to see a little bit more to start in the preseason to really start a Brayshaw. He's been in and out of my team for probably majority of the preseason so far. He's not currently in there. I just think there's a world that he's a minimum 5 points upside, but then there's also a world where I see him being minimum 5 points overpriced with the game style changes and a Sarong next to him taking more points off of him and the whatnot with Shea Bolton and that stuff coming in. So there's a few concerns there and a lot of positives. I just need to see a bit more. So hopefully we get to see a bit more coming into the Pracky matches coming up very shortly. The other ones I probably should mention as I went past them was Zach Butters. I just think he's about where he is. He has shown at times that he can be a very big premium for us. Some people even made the comparisons to like a Gary Ablett, and we know what he's been able to do, 110, 115 sort of guy previously. So there is points in time where I could see him being that sort of player. I did own him all last season and did enjoy a lot of that, but he is a very kamikaze sort of player, so he can get injured quite quickly. And there's probably a world where I think his price is a little bit overs a little bit. Sorry, I keep saying that. The fact that Rosie was out for a couple games last season meant that he was the main guy in there that gave him a few more points during those particular games. So there's a world that he's a bit overpriced, very similar to a Jason Norton-Francis, which I'll talk about in the next video. So I just don't think there's too much upside in what the likes of Butters can do, but I do really like their start to the season. So he's definitely one that you could pay up for if you're willing to pay for a guy that doesn't have the early buy. He's probably going to give you exactly what you pay for. He's looking like he's fit and healthy, and there's probably not too much to change there for him. So you're pretty consistent. He'll be around that sort of price and be around that sort of top 8 area. So here's another one you could look at. I think that's probably about it in terms of the premiums. I guess maybe Noah Anderson was one I could throw in there as well. He just became the captain of the side, so that could free up a few more points for him. Has an awesome start to the season, particularly Essendon and West Coast, and then has the bye, unfortunately. So you would get one game out of him before his bye, and then you have Melbourne, Adelaide, North, and Richmond. So a really strong run to start the season, but then does hit a pretty big wall. So I could see a world where he's averaging 120 to start the season, then drops off to a low hundreds. So he could get you off to a pretty big flyer, but then average out throughout the season. So is there a play that you could have him for the first 5 games and then look to trade him off? It would be a bit tricky because this sort of period of time you really want to be in upgrade season, upgrading all those mid prices and rookies up to the next best, or doing one up, one down, getting the next player in. So it would be very tricky to do and not something that I'm really looking at this point. But if there's anyone that I think that could do the very similar to what Tom Green did last year, I feel like a Noah Anderson could be that sort of player. The one thing that I would like to see him do a lot more this season is that when he plays away from home, he has better games. We saw a lot last year that the Suns just couldn't get a win away from home, and that really was a team effort, whether that was mentality or whatever it was. They just couldn't get a win away from home, and that really reflected in the likes of Noah Anderson's scores, where he just wasn't. He was probably like an 85 guy away from home, but a 110 guy at home. So there's a pretty big gap there, and I just want it to be more consistent away from home. Then he could really take his game to the next level. So he's definitely one that I'll keep an eye on. But again, with the early buy, it's one that I'm probably willing just to cross off and then have a look and see what I can do if he gets off to a fly and I can pick him up, say round 3 or something like that. So that's probably it for the premiums. Now the question I have to finish off with this premiums is that how many premiums do you really realistically want to start your side with? There's a lot of different structures that we're looking at so far this season, and I think most commonly a lot of people are just rolling with one. Most of them, it's either a Bontempelli or a Brayshaw, I'd probably say that one's more than enough. There's probably an argument to say that you don't even need one with all the value options that we have. I think there's probably plenty of underpriced premiums that we will discuss very shortly that you could start and have more certainty that they're going to go up in average and be close to that same sort of average as these guys for a much less price. So that's when my thought process is: am I going to start one or am I going to start zero? I would not be starting two. I don't think there's a way in the world that I'd be starting two. I just don't think there's any necessity to do that. I'd probably only want to go into the season with two captain options. Most likely going to be one in the ruck, as I've spoken about before, whether that's a Cherry or a Marshall, whatnot. Then you probably need one in the midfield or the defensive line from that. So probably one is enough for me. And the other stat that I found pretty interesting, and it was from Miro's Magic, is that from the past 7 fantasy winners, none of their M1s have improved on their average. So, back when I won it in 2023, I started at Brayshaw and he was priced at 112 then, and he dropped down to a 110 average. So it wasn't a huge loss, but it was still a loss. Last year, the likes of Chris started Tom Green as his M1 as an underpriced premium. He went from he was a premium. He was priced at 110 and he dropped below 100. So he had a pretty bad season. Obviously, we know sort of the reason why. He had a few injuries. And I think even the year before me, which was Matt Mottram, he started. What did he start? He started with Jack McRae. I've got this up because I will be talking about a little bit about this later. But yeah, they started a Jack McRae at M1. Then he dropped his average quite significantly. So yeah, it shows to say that you don't have to absolutely nail your M1 pick. That it shows that you can still win even if you don't absolutely nail it, but you could get off to an absolute flyer and could definitely help you be a better fantasy player if you can nail that pick. So definitely something to consider and a bit interesting that I thought anyway. Alrighty, moving into the underpriced premiums, and this is where you sort of get a bit spicy here, and this is where I wish there was a way I could remove the DTP options, but the first option we're looking at, you got to start with Tom Green. He is priced at pretty much exactly 100, 99.9 average from last season over 23 games, priced at $1.025 million. So there's no, it's pretty obvious to say that he is value for all the reasons that I said briefly before, is that he had injury affected games last season, particularly that 7 points in round 8. So just removing that from his average quite simply just makes him, 105 sort of guy pretty comfortably. And there's probably even an argument to say that he wasn't himself for the next 4 or 5 games. Like if you look at his scores or you just look at the game style, he just really wasn't comfortable with his body, and he really didn't look like he was wanted to be out there and wasn't thirsty for the ball. So I think he can easily be a 110 guy, which we have seen in the past pretty consistently, and be a top 8 guy for us pretty shortly. And that even at 109, that puts him at top 2 currently. So he is definitely one that I'm pretty keen on. I know he's got the round 2 bye, but when you were talking about 10 points unders, I'm willing to take that sacrifice for someone that I'm potentially going to have for the entire season. So that's where a world of Tom Green is potentially in my calculations. 40%, 14% of teams are already looking at that. When he overcame his injury, which was about round 15, he became a 107 sort of guy from his averages. So shows you that he's easily going to be 5 points undervalued at a minimum. So again, probably going to be a pretty smash pick. The only probably world I wouldn't select him is if he doesn't do pretty well in the opening round. Say he just scores a flat 100, doesn't really look like he's going to do a huge heap. Who does he play? He plays against Collingwood, so it's an okay matchup, a pretty good matchup based on last year's data. I do expect them to probably be a bit tougher this year with a few more inclusions defensively. So I probably want to see him score probably a 110, 115 to really be a player that, okay, I'll lock into my side just because you go up in coin. He has a pretty good game to start the season in Melbourne. We expect them to be pretty poor again this season. Then he hits the bye in round 2, but then runs into Hawthorn and West Coast. And it's not the greatest star, I will admit that. But if it's someone that is going to be a lock in my side for the entire season, but I'm getting it at a discount price, then you've got to consider that pretty healthy. And it's like a very similar world where we started a Lockie Whitfield last season. You know, he was underpriced for what he showed in the opening round. He did have the round 2 buy, but he ended up becoming a hold for the entire year for us. So there's a very real world that I can see Tom Green being that sort of player for us. So I am heavily looking at him so far this season. Next player moving down is obviously Connor Rosie, and for all very similar reasons. His owners would have a lot of scars from last year where they just played around with him. He was playing, where he wasn't playing, he pulled out halfway through a game. He had 3 injury affected games with hamstring injuries, which obviously affects his average. So looking at his averages, removing those injury scores, he averaged 101. So he's already 4 points unders, and that pushes him into the calculations of being about that sort of top 8 guy, probably just unders, probably that sort of 8 to 12 sort of guy. And I do see a world where he could even push his average closer to 105. You know, he is the captain of the side, another year under his belt. He's still very young. He's 25 now, so he's going to be a good captain option for us. That's the thing about some people about when they're looking at the starting side, is they want to pay top dollar for these big premiums, but there's still no drama with picking Connor Rosie as a captain option for us. You know, he's got the ceiling. He's shown the capacity to hit 150s in the past. If he gets off to a fly and he's shown that capacity, then I would not have any fears about putting the captaincy on him, especially if you're using the VC loophole. Throw the VC on him and then throw the C on a more capable player like your Ruckman or another player that you paid up for. So I have no issues with that. I think he's also very unlikely to get tagged when, with the likes of Butters alongside him and Horn-Francis particularly coming a bit more stronger as well through that midfield. I think both of those players are a bit more dangerous than the likes of Connor Rosie when it comes to midfield impact. So there's that. The cons that I have with him, though, is that based on the 101 average, when you remove his injured scores, he's not a keeper for the year. He doesn't really push him into that calculations of being, a top 20 midfielder. It's probably just outside that, or would be probably about 15th based on the current averages to start the season. So you'd have to probably trade him out throughout the season at some point, so you're not really getting a huge amount of upside. And I just don't think he can get super high. Like, I don't think he's going to be a 110 guy. I just don't see that in his ability, especially with the likes of Horn-Francis and what's his name, Butters alongside him. You've got three midfielders that are pretty much close to averaging 100. Butters at like 106, Horn-Francis is pretty much a 90. Then you've got Connor Rosie right in the middle at pretty much 100. So can all 3 of them average 100? I'm very skeptical. You've got the best fantasy side and like Fremantle that have the likes of Sarong and Brayshaw. Sarong being a 108 guy and Brayshaw being a 104 guy, 105 guy. And then the next best is probably the likes of Hayden Young, which was a 85, 90 guy last season. So that's probably about the cap that I can see them, a couple of hundreds and then a 90 guy. So if we're expecting the likes of Horn-Francis to improve this season, getting more midfield time, what does that mean for the likes of Connor Rosie? Does that mean he spends more time forward? Because my personal opinion, I think the Rosie is a much more dangerous forward than he is a midfielder. And out of the 3 midfielders in Butters, Horn-Francis and Rosie, I see him being the most dangerous out of those guys. So he could spend a bit more time forward there. And so I just don't know if I see a world where he does increase his average a huge amount besides that 101, where I don't know if it's enough on the bone for me to select him at the side. But definitely when I'm having a look out, like I'll show you his start of season as well. It's pretty damn good. No early buy, Collingwood, Richmond, Essendon to start off. So 3 pretty good rounds. All could be pretty good captain options for us. Does have a bit of a touch-up patch with St Kilda, Hawthorn and Sydney. Really doesn't free up until later in the season. So it's pretty good to start, but not for a long period of time. But again, you're probably not looking for a long period of time with the likes of Rosie when you're not expecting him to be a keeper for the entire season. So you want him to get off to a flyer and just make him unachievable for other players, other coaches, and put on some pretty good points for us. Next person is pretty highly spoken about as well, and that is Tim Taranto. He is 11 point owned at the moment. Obviously down priced at 96. And for the man who has averaged 124 in the first half of 2023, he is far beyond what he has done previously. Had 2 injury affected games last season, which would bump up his average to 100. So again, not a huge amount, and probably doesn't put him into the calculations of that top 8, not even top 15. The thing I wanna point out is with Hopper and without Hopper. I think it's pretty common knowledge across the community fantasy, the fantasy community. That's the word I meant to say. Is that without Hopper he averages much higher. He's a 112 guy without Hopper, but with Hopper he is an 87 sort of guy. I don't know why that is, whether it's a mentality thing or just the more physicality around the ball doesn't rely on Taranto to be in there as much. I don't think I've seen the stats where his tackles drop down at all while Hopper's in. He just doesn't seem to be that interested in getting the ball and just relies on other people as well. So, but what are we expecting from him to start this season? So with Richmond being probably a lot worse to start, throughout the season, with obviously they sold out with a lot of their players. They had 4 major players leave, so that opens up pretty much a third of their fantasy points from last season into the squad, and they're already scoring pretty badly as a team overall. So where are those points going to go? I do feel like some of those could go to Taranto, as the main man in the middle. They will rely on him a fair bit more, being the mature body with a lot of younger players around him. Lawler going into the midfield, does that just give more Taranto more points in there? And a few others, in the forward line and the back, just may look towards him here and there, just as that mature age body that can take a lot of the pressure off those guys. So there is a world where I could see him upgrading his average to a 105, just based on that alone, but it is pretty speculative, and there's nothing to say that that's guaranteed to happen. The other thing I really want to see in the practice matches is, are they going to start playing this North Melbourne game where they start to possess the ball a lot more? North Melbourne for the last probably 3 or 4 years, there's the Z-ball and the Hall days where they just possess the ball in the halfback and absolutely rack up back there. We've shown that Taranto is a pretty good 2-air runner, and he gets back to the defensive 50 pretty well. So as a world, that even jumps up his average a fair bit. So that could be enough to say that, okay, they're going to be damage limitation. They're going to chip around the ball a fair bit, hold on to it a bit more. So that there's a world that Taranto just gets amongst that. And along with his tackling pressure, could be enough to bump him up to a 105 average, if not push back closer to that a 110 average, which we all know he's capable of. Obviously averaging that 124 to start the season back in 2023. So there's that. The other thing, which probably is a negative, is that they've hard run to start the season. Here goes Carlton, Port, St Kilda, Brisbane, and Fremantle. All teams that are probably, 4 of them are guaranteed to be probably finalists and pretty restrictive to fantasy points. St Kilda is probably up in the air in terms of what they're going to be doing this season. So it is a pretty tough run to season, so there's no guarantee that he's going to get off to a flyer, and no guarantee that he's going to jump up in average just instantly. So if I were to look at, general defenders, just if that was something that he was going to be going down back a little bit more, they do have Carlton, which is a tough one. Port's neutral. St Kilda is obviously an easy one, and Brisbane's tough as well. So nothing there is telling me that he's going to get off to an absolute flyer and there's any reason to jump on him straight away. There's probably a world where I can just wait and see, okay, when is he going to pop? Can I jump on him at that stage? Upgrading a mid-pricer or something like that to him. So there's probably a world where I just think of wait and see what he's going to do and what Richmond are going to do. So there's that one. should probably get through at least some of it a bit quicker. So moving along down the list, I'm going to do Darcy Parish next. Now, a lot of people probably won't look at this too much and probably just skip over this section because he is 1% owned. But considering what this guy has been in the past for us, he's been a 107 guy back in 2023 and has been a 100 guy for us for the past 3 seasons before that. He is well underpriced. His average is at break even at 92, and he's easily 8 points of value right off the top of the bat. So there's a world where I have looked at it, and he hasn't spent a huge amount of time on my side just yet, but considering he had an injury-riddled season last year, only played the 12 games, he has a stupidly long contract, so they're guaranteed to pretty much use him. He obviously didn't trade him last season like they thought they would, but he is definitely value. So you're going to look at that and see what his role is going to be, especially with talks like a Zach Merritt moving into the back line a little bit more, especially in the preseason match simulations. Do they just rely on a Parish to be that number one man in the midfield alongside Caldwell and a Durham and Will Setterfield and stuff like that to go in there and let Zach Merritt just come off the halfback using his elite kicking like we all know he can do? So there's a world I can see that absolutely happening. So I'm just keeping a mindful eye on that in the preseason. The only annoying thing about Parish is obviously the round 4 bye. Tougher run to start the season. I'll show you that. Essendon. So obviously we don't get the first game. He's got Hawthorn, Adelaide, and Port Adelaide. So 3 tougher teams to start the season, and then hits the bye instantly. So it's really after that point where I'd probably really want to look to jump on. He's got that 3-4 game nice stretch that could be pretty juicy. So I want to keep a pretty close eye on that and maybe buy in on round 4 because I definitely could see him being a keeper for us for the season if he can get back to his accumulative best, as we all know he can be. And the other thing is, have the Bombers gone past him? With Durham and Caldwell coming through the ranks particularly last season. Is Darcy Parish going to spend a lot more time in the midfield anymore? It's speculative, so I'm not really sure where his role currently is. I assume he's going to be a full-time midfielder again. That's what he did to start last season. So it'll be interesting to watch. So keep an eye on that one. I should have kept that pretty close. Next one, and this will finish off the segment for the the fallen premiums, underpriced premiums, whatever you want to call them. It's Petrarca. Now, I understand that he has an injury so far this preseason, obviously battling with that fractured rib. He had a broken rib last year, the back end, but he's been a 105 guy for the best part of a couple of years now. He was a 105 guy back in 2023. Obviously had a very weird year last year where he wasn't super happy with the club. There was a lot of off-field issues at Melbourne. So I think that with him having a better preseason and that the team's on a better wavelength and a better vibe, I think there's a world where he goes back to being that 105 guy quite comfortably and being back to a full-time midfielder again, or what he was doing, pretty much an 80-20 sort of split. So with what he's being able to do, I have to look at him. He doesn't have the early season bye, so he is definitely a consideration that is probably one of the better options in terms of a lot of these underpriced premiums. Tom Green's got the early season bye, so you're going to get that extra game from him. He is a lot cheaper than those sort of guys. Potentially is 15 points of values, 10 at a minimum, I would say. But it's just the concerning part is with Melbourne declining and assumed to continue to decline. They're getting a pretty aging list now with Gawn probably on his last couple of legs for the last couple of seasons. Oliver obviously declined last year, but expected to be a lot better. And they're struggling all over the ground in terms of they don't have much of a forward line anymore. Backs are looking pretty underdone now with Lever and May getting on in their career. So I expect them to continue to decline. They obviously had the premiership back in 2021. So they've been in the light and they're probably on the way down now. So with that could mean a lot less points for the team as a whole, which obviously could affect, the main stars of their team that are the fantasy guys. So I got to keep an eye on that. Obviously, the off-field issues we're not going to really know until things come out a little bit more. But from all reports, it is seeming to be a lot more of a happier life at Melbourne, so that's a positive. The thing that gives me a little bit of concern as well is that he wasn't particularly played out of position last year. He just had a lot of unfamiliar scores, unusual scores where he was scoring 60s and 70s. Obviously, he does get a bit of attention because he is such a damaging player, particularly up forward. And obviously Oliver wasn't at his best, so they weren't really focusing on Oliver too much, so that could have been the reason. But really, realistically, to keep an eye on his injury first and foremost. If he can overcome that and play the practice matches, I have no issues flying into him and backing him in to be a preseason pick for us. It's really just I need to see a little bit more in the preseason. So there's a lot of things that could go his way for him. So keep an eye on Petrarca. A few other guys that I probably should have mentioned in this category was Ed Richards. I did mention him briefly before with the Bontempelli and whatnot. I just think that I don't see a world with, Treloar, Bontempelli and stuff. I don't see his ceiling. He's very volatile in his scoring, and I don't think the scoring comes purely from CBAs. He had some big big CBA roles, and it didn't always accumulate to big fantasy points. So I don't see a world where I think he could be a premium. I think he's a pretty good 90 to 100 sort of guy, but anything above that, it would be above and beyond what I expect from him. Laird was another one that obviously we're going to look at for a long-term season perspective. We're expecting he's going to get the DDP of defensive status because he's moving to this halfback role. He has been a 105 guy back there previously for us when he was the number one number one defender. So we know he can rack up the ball. So he's one that I'm probably not looking at starting, but I'm definitely keeping an eye on if he does look like he has that massive role of a halfback role. Priced at 99, if he can be a 105 to 110 guy as a defender, then absolutely there's a potential I could lock that in. So keep an eye on that. It's just a concern of, going back there. A lot of other guys back there as well. So there's that. And Josh Dacos is probably one of the more interesting ones that's popped up on my list recently. Obviously, he's a very awkward price, priced at 95. 973k, so it's a very awkward price, but he is moving into a halfback role and potentially going to be the main distributor of halfback for the Collingwood Magpies next season. So obviously we've seen his brother do it, in his debut season, and he averaged 112. So, and Josh Dacos is no slouch when it comes to the Dacoses either. He's been a very capable wingerman to be a 95 average winger. I just think with being more in the center of the ground, being access to more of the ball, there's definitely a world where I could see him being a premium defender for us. So I definitely want to keep an eye on him and what his role continues to be like through the part of the preseason and the pracky matches. So keep an eye on that one. Moving into the mid-prices, and I will try and make this a bit quicker because there are a few names that go through here, and I've already gone for fucking 50 minutes. My bad, guys. This is going to be a longer one, but like I said, this is such a vital line that you need to get right. So, first off top, I won't talk too much about Clayton Oliver. I just think he's a walk-up lock for us. He's obviously one of the most popular players to start the season. I wish there was a way I could do this a bit easier rather than keep scrolling. He's pretty much a lock, like I said. Walk up. He's priced down at 78. He's been a 115 guy previously, so he's looking like he's fit. Looks like he's healthy in the preseason. Back into the full-time midfield role. Looks like he's in a much better place mentally with the Melbourne Football Club. So I just don't see a world where he's not going to at least become a 90 guy. There's probably speculation that he may not become that 115 guy for us ever again. There's no telling us what the stuff that he was on was improving his performance like. So I'm not really expecting him to be that 110 guy. I do expect him to probably become a 100 guy. So that's 22 points under. So that's a lock in anyone's side. So just lock it in. Doesn't have the early buy. The run to start the season in terms of a midfield. GWS are not the greatest, but from there is pretty cruisy. Probably a good 6 or 7 game stretch there, which I'm pretty confident with. So you probably lock him in pretty comfortably. Same could be for Petrarca. I just didn't go into it a little bit. Stephen Canelio is my next one, and if you didn't read my article on the DT Talks website, whatever you want to call that. Definitely go look at that. I thought it was a pretty good read. I did write that, and I thought there was a lot of good points in there. But he is priced down at 77, 789k. Yes, he's older at 31, but he had an injury riddle 2024, ribs, knee, face injuries, all the works pretty much, and he was subbed out on 4 different occasions throughout the season with very low scores. So that really dramatically brought his fantasy numbers down. And the thing that always made me laugh a little bit is that when you consider that he has a very similar fantasy history to the likes of Oliver, where he has been a 110 guy previously and been a pretty consistent 105 guy throughout his career. But no one's really talking about him as much as the likes of Oliver. And probably arguably has more of a reason to be priced down here than what Oliver does. Oliver was still playing in the best position he could and wasn't injured. He played pretty much a lot of the games, 21 games, whereas likes of Cornelio didn't play many games, 13 games, was injured a lot of those games, and was played out of position just finish the season because they were just managing his body and hit the shoulder that he had preseason had post-season surgery on. So there's a world where I just see Cornelio having a fit and healthy preseason and absolutely smashing the practice matches and everything and becoming that number 2 midfielder again at GWS. I think they're well and truly still in the window of being premiership favourites. So do they just go back to the well instead of promoting these guys like a what are these names coming to me? I can't remember his name now. Doesn't matter. There's a few other guys at Collingwood at GWS that are pushing for that midfield spot, but I just see a world where I think Cornelio goes back into the midfield, be the number 2, and can easily average 95, if not push into the hundreds again, because that's just what he can do. So he only averaged 102 last season. So it's just, it's ridiculous to me to think that he is quite underpriced, and he's spent a lot of time in my fantasy side so far this season. The concern is that he still isn't participating in match simulations so far this preseason, so they are really being careful with what his injuries are. I thought he would be a bit better now having the post-season surgery, and he was back to running and stuff in December, so he should be fit. It's just he's not having that physical contact with players just yet. So big watch for me. Obviously round 2 bye does hurt, but for someone that is potentially 20, 30 points underpriced, you're locking that in every day of the week. Doherty is next on the list for good reason. Obviously, he has been the number 1 defender for us previously in a couple of years. He averaged at 110 and 102 in the past 2 seasons prior to last season. Now, he only played 2 games for the entire season last year, obviously with that ACL injury in round 1 there. Scored a 48 at halftime in round 0 and scored a 67 in the elimination final, which they did get badly beaten in that game. So I'll probably discount that last score quite significantly. I'm really looking at that first score where he was on track for being a 100 guy. So if he's given the right role, and I do expect him to play in that halfback role, I know there's a lot of talks about Elijah, who we will talk about in a second. But I just see a world where he's at least 10 points unders. 10 to 15 if given the right role in the halfback. Even as a winger, he's probably an 85 guy. So there's still a world where I absolutely lock him in no matter what role he plays. But ideally, I want him in that halfback role where we've seen him absolutely accumulate before and had that fantasy prowess about him. It's just, again, the all-match reports have shown him in the preseason that he is a winger. He's been playing them predominantly, but only recently he's really moved that back to halfback, with the likes of Nick Newman being out due to the injury with the ACL or Achilles injury, so he's done for the season. So I could see a world where both, I keep saying that, I see a world where Hollands and Doherty are the main distributors off halfback. That probably does limit both their upsides in terms of being 110 guys, but if they can Doherty pushed to be a 100 guy and Hollands to be a 90 guy, then absolutely they're both really, really good picks. So keeping a pretty big eye on those sort of guys. Scrolling down even further, we've got Will Day, who is pretty popular at 25%, and for good reason. Obviously, he had a pretty big injury affected season last year, only playing the 16 games. missing the start of the season with a foot injury, and then dislocated his collarbone through the season as well. So he is pretty much 20 points unders of what he did in 2023, and there was some very low scores in that as well, where probably were unaccounted for, where maybe that collarbone was frustrating him a little bit. He's now had post-season surgery, or he's back to full fitness, so he should be a lot better this season. So he's probably another one that you could lock into your side. Again, it's just the early round buy, round 4, which isn't too bad. Round 4, you could say he's earned enough cash in the first 4 weeks to be okay. I can move off him at that point. We did very similar to the likes of James Jordan last year, so could treat him very similar. It's just if you think he can have that great start of the season. The thing that concerns me the most about a Will Day is the Hawthorn game style. It's become very handball happy. We saw in the back end of last season that they really want to fling it off halfback, and that doesn't always mean it's going through the midfield. Whereas Will Day was predominantly relying on a lot of these marks in 2023 when he was having these massive scores. So I don't know where I see him getting back to that 95. I can still probably see him being a 90 average player, just based on what he's able to do. There's talks that he will spend a little bit more time forward. He's got a pretty good mark overhead with just his athletic ability to leap, and obviously with Hawthorn having a few forward line issues with injuries with tall forwards. So there's a potential that he does spend more time forward. There's also a potential that he gets tagged a fair bit. He is probably by far the best player at Hawks in terms of their status. He's a pretty well-known midfielder, so he could be tagged quite regularly, especially with Hawthorn being a lot better this season, probably pushing for top 4, if not definitely top 8. So there's a lot to like, but there's also a lot to be concerned about with what he is going to be doing. He's still very young at the same time, 23, so he's been on the edge of my team in and out, but it is obviously a genuine mid-price that we're going to consider. Probably at least 15 points unders of what he's being able to do. Cherry is up next on the list, and probably won't dive too much deep into this one because as the season gets on, I'm less and less liking this pick, even though I think he can go back to being his 90 average player. Had a shocking 2024, full of injuries, hamstrings, and whatnot. It just seems to be a common theme that he just has a lot of hamstrings currently. So I think I saw a stat that he's had 5 hamstrings in the last 12 months. So that is obviously a very big concern of his. He's gone over to Doha to try and overcome those issues. So that will be probably a positive in terms of, they do some very good work over there, and they've got a lot of the bigger injury history guys to get back onto the field and be much healthier. So I do like that he's done that. I just think it's very unlikely that you're going to get extended amount of games out of him for a big period of time, just given, injuries, a potential that they rest him, just given they have that injury history. So if he gets a bit of a tight hamstring at any point, they just say, take the week off, rest up and put your legs up and see how you go next week. So I wouldn't guarantee him to be fit every single week. I also just haven't seen any news of him pretty much in the preseason. Obviously, in match simulations, he's probably not training as heavy, still trying to overcome those hamstring injuries. Obviously, like I said, he went to Doha. So there hasn't been a huge amount of information that's come out about him just yet. But the things I do like about him is that, with Matt Kennedy being out of the side now, going to Western Bulldogs, that does potentially mean that he has a better role. There was always that awkward stage where either Kennedy or Terrell was sort of the 4th midfielder. By far, I think now he becomes that 4th midfielder pretty consistently, and that means his role should be a bit more consistent. But you also throw in the likes of Jagger Smith, who's coming in as a debutant, a rookie. So where do they throw in him? So yeah, it's a confusing one, and one I need to see a little bit more. So there's no doubt that I think Cherry is undervalued. He's been a pretty consistent 90 guy for the best part of 3 years. He averaged 96 back in 2023 and was high 80s during 22 and 21. So he's probably 10, 15 points undervalued at minimum. So definitely for those reasons, you have to keep an eye on him. And if he can be fit and firing through the preseason, then could sneak into the fantasy sides. Similarly with his teammate in a Ollie Hollands, if I can find him. Obviously for all the same reasons as a Sam Doherty, with Newman being out, moving to this halfback role, he's shown a bit of a capacity to be a fantasy player with some decent scores in the back end of last season, where he averaged he scored 94, 105, and 98, sort of in a very similar role in that halfback. So there's a world where I can see him being a 95 to 100 sort of averaging player as the main halfback distributor. So he's well under that, being priced at 62. That's 30 points of upside. So for obvious reasons, you need to have a look at him. I just need to see it on field because at this point in time, I'm not super confident in locking him in. And I think it's pretty common across the fantasy community, only being 4% owned at the moment. But that is slowly creeping up more and more as we get close to this season because, it's becoming pretty consistent that he is that guy, and that's what they want him to do. So he could be that Nick Martin of 2024, where Nick Martin obviously went from the wing to the halfback and absolutely racked up there. So the thing that I find a bit strange is that he's not the best. He doesn't have the best kicking ability. He's not been known for his kicking ability. So why would you want a player like that in your halfback? Whereas you can have a Doherty that does have an lethal kick and has a booming kick as well that can get it deep in their forward line. I'd personally, if I was the coach of Carlton, which luckily I'm not, I'd be throwing Doherty back there much more than a Hollands would be there. So that's just my opinion. There's definitely merit to both picks, so I'm just keeping a mindful eye on which one's going to be more likely to end up on my side. There's still potential that both end up on my side because they both have very good runs to start the season, and no early buy is a massive positive too. Then we come into the Adelaide boys, and that starts with James Peatling, probably the one I'm more confident in. Obviously, he comes from the GWS Giants, where he was used in a bunch of different roles last season, playing 17 games. Sorry, guys, I need to take a drink real quick. So he is priced down at 62. So very cheap, 634k. And the thing I really like about him is when he had 40% times CBAs at GWS, he averaged 88 over 11 games. So that's a pretty decent portion of games to say that he has some fantasy prowess against for him. And I think he's going to play a very similar role at Adelaide. All reports are saying that he's going to play some bulk CBAs, but also spend some time on the wing, depending on when they need him here and there. Because he's obviously got a big tackling prowess against him. He's a strong tackler. He's very ferocious at the ball and likes to throw his weight around a little bit. So he's pretty much been locked on my side since the start of the preseason. So he's probably one of the ones I'm pretty confident in. I think he's by far going to be an 80 guy at a minimum. So that's 19 points. Obviously, a pretty good start to the season. No early buy. A very good price. Very good age. There's just so many positives about this guy. I'm really struggling to find any negatives at this point in time. The only thing I will say is obviously the midfield rotation is pretty tight. Like I said before, you got Dawson, Crouch, Saligo, Berry that runs through there, but Berry's probably not in the side as much this season. You got Rankin that runs through there a fair bit. And obviously the inclusions of a Cumming and a Neil Bullen in the side, and you've got even a Rochelle that could run through there, and obviously a Laird that has moved out of there recently. So they have so many potential players that could run through that midfield. It does give me some concerns, but it's not probably something that I'm super worried about. I think he's locked in as a wingman, and he will spend a bit of time in the midfield through some CBAs, or at least around the stoppages at some point in time. So I'm locking him inside my side at this point in time. Then moving on to the next player, that is Isaac Cumming, who is obviously a lot cheaper, 535k. So he is well down there in terms of what he's able to do. And you got to start with the fact that he has been a 90 guy for us previously, which is crazy to think that was only 2 years ago. He is massively 34 points unders from that then. I'm not saying that he will be a 90 average guy again. I don't think he will have that main distributor role off halfback. I think he's going to share that a lot with the likes of Laird, and even a Keynes back there that does soak up a lot of points. So I think he's probably going to be maybe a 75 sort of guy. 70 to 75 is probably more realistic, and maybe he can push 80s If depending on what Laird is doing, maybe if Laird's not a 105 guy, then that definitely provides more points for the likes of Cumming. So I'm still pretty keen on what Cumming can do. I would like to see him get a lot more kick-ins, which he has done previously for GWS. There's actually some talk that he even spends some time in the CBAs. The Crows are going into the season with a lot of flexibility, so I'm pretty bullish on what they're going to be able to do this season. The cons are that he does have a pretty fairly injury history. So obviously he had a lot of hamstring injuries previously, and he's even had one to start the season so far. It's just the uncertainty of his role is probably the main concern for me. I want him to have a lockdown role. I think that'll pretty much be on the halfback, but he may spend some time on the wing or even the CBAs here and there. I just think he's gonna bump up his average at least sort of 20 points. So there's definitely a world where I start him, and I have had him in my side quite regularly so far. So just based off that alone, I am looking like I'm starting probably 3 or 4 mid prices. On Oliver, Canelio, a Doherty, and then you've got the likes of Peatling and Cumming. So that's 5 right there alone. So there's just so much value at the moment, and that does round us off with the mid prices. So there's so many options that we're looking at, and I'll even speak about some more options here in a Dylan Shields, who is moving into a halfback role. I don't know what he's priced at. I should just look him up, I think. He's moving from a halfback role from a midfield role, so moving into that juicy role where Nick Martin obviously racked up last season. So here's one I'll keep an eye on, but probably unlikely to start just because I think his fringe 22 at best. He's definitely past his prime in terms of what he's been able to do at GWS and whatnot. Caleb Windsor is also another one that's moving into that halfback role for Melbourne. A bit cheaper price, so a lot younger, obviously into his second year. Was a wingman previously last year and had shown some capacity to be a fantasy accumulator, so one I'll keep an eye on, but probably unlikely to start at that more expensive price than a lot of these other guys. Angus Sheldrick is one I'm closely keeping an eye on, probably not as highly owned as what others I would expect, but he has shown that he has fantasy prowess to him. Absolutely, he's averaged well over 100 in the VFL for the last couple of seasons, and even when he came into the Sydney AFL squad side in 2023, he was averaging 80. So he is 40 points unders from what he could potentially do if he's given the right role, and with Parker out, that does open a spot for what he can do. And from the match simulation reports, he is absolutely tearing up the track. So I am pretty bullish on what he can do, so I'm keeping a close eye on him. The early buy does hurt, and it's a tough run to start the season, but when you're that cheaply priced, you don't really look into that too much as a breakout season. He's entering his 3rd or 4th season. And then you got Nathan O'Driscoll is another one that I have kept a close eye on. Likely to take a full-time wing role on the opposite wing of a Jeremy Sharp, and we all know what he did last season, jumping up his average to 80. Priced at 43, he is definitely one that could definitely improve his average to probably a 70 or at least a 65 from what he's shown previously. So if we get desperate for a few picks, then I'm pretty confident that he will be best 22 this season. I guess the question is, how many of these mid prices can you start? And it's a tricky question because a lot of different structures are coming from this. Like I said, you're probably starting one premium, at least one of the underpriced premiums in a Christian Petrarca or an Orosi or a Tom Green, and then you're really limited for spots after that because when I talk about the rookies, there's a lot of options in terms of the rookies that you want to be on field or you want to be in your side generating cash. So you probably can, at minimum, I would say you want 3 of these mid-pricer guys. That's sort of what's worked previously. I'd probably even argue you could go to 5. That's probably what I'm looking at, and not spending up as much on the premiums as such. I'll probably go with an underpriced premium and then 4 or 5 mid prices, and then running 2 or 3 rookies in the midfield. So there's so many different structures you can do. There's no guarantee which one's going to work for us, but it's just some different strategies around how much, how many mid prices you should be thinking you should have. And I don't think it's absolutely ridiculous to say that 5 you could start with this season. There's that much value, and there's probably so much confidence in, and Oliver, he's going to become pretty close to a hold for the season. Doherty, if he can have that role. Canelio, like I said, if he gets back to that same role, he could be a hold for the season. But then you get to the speculative picks like a Peatling, a Cumming, and stuff like that, which are probably more like your cash generators that are in your team for a short period of time, generating your cash, getting those points on field. So there, I have no problem with locking in a fair few of these guys and just running with that, acting like they're underpriced premiums or even premiums at this point. To finish off the episode, I'll quickly just go through some of the rookies that we're looking at so far this season. Obviously, Lawler is off the top. He's the most expensive, being the number 1 draftee. At the start of the preseason, I wasn't super bullish on him because he hadn't shown much of a fantasy game to him. He's more of that impact midfielder like Horn, Francis, and whatnot. But obviously, he's very underpriced for what he can do. Just not so sure what he's going to do in his first season. Obviously, you have Tigers being quite down on their performance. I'd probably limit him at a 60, but even then, I still think he's a very good pick. It is a bit more of an pricey one at 340k, but he is going to be best 22 from all reports. He's not having any injury concerns. He did average 94 in the Talent League, so he does have some capacity of racking up. I just want to see the role of what he's going to play alongside, a Taranto, a Hopper, and a few others in that midfield mix there. So, one to keep an eye on. Finn O'Sullivan, number 2 pick at North, and if we know anything about North, is that they like to treat their rookies very well. McKercher and Sheasel for the last 2 years, they just throw them in the deep end in a pretty cushy role. So I do see a world where he just comes in round 1 and just plays a pretty genuine role. From all reports, he is playing a wing role, so I do feel pretty bullish on what he can do out there. He has shown to be a decent fantasy scorer previously, not massively, but can be okay. Like, he scored a 79 in the Talent League for 4 games in what was a heavily interrupted season for him. So to go up pick 2 when he was injured for a lot of the season shows you that he does have a lot of upside and what he can do. And obviously, just with what North do with their rookies alone is enough to warrant just to keep an eye on him, because a lot of these rookies have gone into the halfback line and absolutely racked up for. So if he even gets a whiff of that, then he is way unders, and he's going to be a big cash generator for us. Jagger Smith, the next one down, pick 3 at the Colton Blues. He is by far probably one of the better fantasy scorers from the draft league. I think he's pretty much slotted into the blue side pretty comfortably. I think he'll be in there straight away. He's a ready-made midfielder. I think he slots in there alongside the likes of Cripps, Walsh, and then obviously you got George Hewitt in there as well. I think he probably becomes the 4th or 5th midfielder that they like to rotate through there. So he will definitely improve on his average, and he loves to get his hand on the ball. So he will be a big cash generator for us. So he's a lock in my side. Sid Draper is another one that is absolutely killing up the track in Adelaide. He's a ready-made midfielder again. Could come into the side, probably a bit more speculative because of obviously all the reasons that I said against like Peatling. They have a lot of midfield players that rotate through that midfield. What his role is going to be, I'm not 100% sure just yet, but he is ready-made to play AFL, and if they want to get games into this guy, then there's definitely a good chance of that. He's a strong tackler. I probably see him being more of a half forward, just with a few more availabilities up there. So pretty keen on what he'll be able to do, and he's locked into my sides currently. Levi Ashcroft has spent a lot of time on my side and a lot of team on everyone else's side. He's 56% owned so far, and obviously the big name of Ashcroft just perks your ears up enough to say that he's going to be a fantasy scorer for us at some point. Obviously, going to the Brisbane Lions is a tough ask, though, given that they just come off premiership. They've got a full strength list, and they don't really have too many injuries. They've even got players coming back from injury from last season. So there's probably a speculation, is there actually a role for Levi Ashcroft to play in the best 22. It is speculative at best. There's even concerns that he will start as a sub because the sub rule is staying this season. So for that reason, he's in and out of my side currently, just because I'm not 100% sure he's going to be there round one. But he has shown more than anyone in terms of fantasy scores. He scored a 145 in one VFL game last season. So knows how to rack up the peel, so want to keep an eye on. Harvey Langford is another one that I'm pretty bullish on at Melbourne. He averaged 119 4 games in under 18 and 100 in 15 games in the Talent League. So he knows how to rack up the peel and probably one of the bigger fantasy players in the league. I'm just not 100% sure what role he'll be playing. Looking at that midfield, you got Oliver Petrarca, then you've got the likes of Viney, probably that third guy. They're even trying to throw Rivers in the mix there as probably that fourth midfielder now. So midfield spots are pretty limited there for them. With Windsor potentially going into the halfback role, does that open up a wing role for the likes of Harvey Langford? Is probably my best guess, but he's also got his teammate in Lindsay. That is another one that I probably could bring up here that is fighting for a position who has shown some fantasy prowess against him. So it'll be a fight out of those two about who gets that sort of position. So big watch on those two guys. Josh Smiley has spent a lot of time on my side this season because he absolutely started the preseason on fire with a ready-made body, a bigger body to go into the midfield, and but he has recently had an injury, so he has dropped out of my side a bit more. I think he had a hamstring injury, so they will treat that a little bit carefully with obviously being so young. So be wary about that when you're starting him in your side. He's still potentially going to be there round one, but I'm not sure I'll be starting him just yet. Besides that, that's probably about it in terms of all the main guys that you want to look at. There are obviously a lot of guys at a basement price that you could look at, like a Hull from West Coast Eagles. He's 267k. They've obviously got a lot of midfield concerns at the moment with a few injuries, so he could potentially be going to there. Obviously, being a pretty good fantasy scorer for in the draft and in the waffle over there. And that's probably where I'll finish it off in terms of the midfielder. So plenty of options you want to keep there. And these guys are really going to determine our structure, I think. If round one comes around and we get probably 6 or 7 of these guys, then I think we have no choice but to lock a fair few of these guys in because they have such fantasy games about them that they're going to be massive cash generators for us this season. And obviously cash is king in this game. So you're going to lock that in over points pretty comfortably, and I'd definitely be locking that in the utility spot for sure as well. So keep an eye on those guys. Now to finish off the episode, I quickly wanted to go past what has won in the past in terms of the winning team of the last 3 years. So I'll start with Matty Mottram and looking at his midfield particularly. So he started with 1 premium and 1 underpriced premium in Josh Kelly. And obviously Neil was an underpriced, and then he had Cripps as the mid-pricer. So he went sort of a bit of a guns and rookie sort of style where he went mostly a premiums and had guys that had done it there before. And Cripps was looking absolutely immaculate in that season, so he went ballistic. And then he had 4 rookies, which obviously with Rao racking it up, we know how good he was going to be. Dacos, obviously a big name, was expected to be pretty big as well. Horn Francis was the number 1 pick, so we were pretty confident what he was going to do. So it probably worked out pretty well that was a year that you could go that, but I'm sure there was potential that there was other mid-prices that you could say. So for this year it worked. If you move on to the year that I won, I started with 1 premium, 1 underpriced premium, then I went midfield heavy with Setterfield, Sheed, and Warple as my mid prices. Now I'll say that Setterfield and Warple were pretty good mid prices. They got off to the start of the season pretty well. It made me a lot of cash, particularly Setterfield. He was pretty uniquely owned, whereas Dom Sheed, while he increased his average, it wasn't like anything impressive. So that one probably was a bit of a fail in my eyes. So I did jump off him pretty early on. And in that year, there probably wasn't as many rookies that I was super keen on. Looking at the list that we had there, None of those guys sort of lit up the world and are still sort of struggling. Obviously, Philippou still yet to see. Mackenzie hasn't sort of broken into the Hawthorn side, and Ollins obviously is one of the bigger guys, and same with Ashfield. So that probably worked out in my strategy, going that sort of mid-price strong strategy. Whereas Chris last year went with a premium to start with 110 averaging Tom Green, an underpriced premium in Jack Steele, and then he went mid-price heavy with Martin, Amon, and Wines being the mid-prices, obviously being that 90 sort of to 70 sort of price range. And then he went 3 rookie. So it shows you that for the last couple of years, it's been that sort of, you want to have one stable guy, one guy that's probably going to be close to a keeper for the year, and then a couple mid prices. So it is such a vital position that if you can nail it, can absolutely win you the high luck. So keep this in mind, guys, and hopefully you've got some information out of this video to say that, okay, I'm more confident in picking this guy. And really looking at your structure as a whole. So hopefully you've enjoyed. Please leave a like and a subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Catch you later. Bye.